Hello, and welcome to episode 11 of The Upstanding Rector and the Curious Christian. The Upstanding Rector is Reverend David J. Lucey, Rector of St. Francis Episcopal Church in Great Falls, Virginia, and I'm Kathy Woolman, the Curious Christian. Today we're going to be talking about a subject that may be a bit tender, but is something that every family has to deal with, and that is the funeral service, the uh, rite of Christian burial, and what the Episcopal Church and the Book of Common Prayer say about what a Christian burial should look like. So, David, can you start us out? What's the overview? What is it supposed to look like?
Well, the overview is that Christian burial and the encounter of people who are still here and with us with someone who's died is intended as a process. So there is a funeral service, a burial service that they talk about. There is also the actual committal to the ground. There's a commendation to God. There are prayers for a vigil. There are prayers for somebody who is at the point of dying. So you see over that outline that the thing about death is it is a process, and I think one of the things that we encounter in the church in this day is to not want to go through the process. We want to have a moment. It's a very American Western thing. We want a moment that encompasses everything, and do it all in an hour and five, and and then we're done. And the truth of the matter is, when someone close to you dies, mourning is a process. It doesn't happen all at one time. It doesn't happen in neat and orderly fashion. I had a parishioner in one of my churches, and her husband of a long period of time had died, probably 5 or 6 years before I was called there. And here she was 5 or 6 years later, and I would tell you that my experience of her, wonderful woman that she was, in many ways vivacious, she was still in deep mourning. Mm. And so people do things differently, and I can tell you there are other people who will suddenly, in the middle of shopping at a mall, suddenly be overcome by grief for someone who died years ago. So I think when we deal with burial, we're dealing with the real sense of disturbance in chronological time, and the encounters with Kairos time, chronological time being month, days, years, minutes, hours, as we acknowledge them here and now. Something physics tells us may be not as real as we think, and Kairos time, which is God's time. And if God lives in an eternal present, the breaking throughs would be they're right now, whatever those things are. So the overview is mourning or encounter of death starts before the person dies and can continue on in a lifelong way.
Mm-hmm. So when a family comes to see you to prepare for a burial service,
right?
I'm imagining that one of the things on a lot of people's mind would be, when do I give my eulogy? When do I talk about my beloved? Well, what's the role of eulogy, and what do you say to people when they ask questions like that?
So there are a few things. First of all, some families, especially this church, get a hold of me before death actually happens. They have somebody who's dying. They would like prayers. They would like somebody to be there with them as the dying happens, and that's more possible today because of hospice care and things like that, where we're, I think, changing our attitude about this. And I think it's a healthy change. Visiting somebody in hospice without a whole bunch of cords and tubes attached to them, or the bare minimum, to help ease pain or things like that, is way more fulfilling or gentle than going to a hospital room with beepings and everything else going on. And in those prayers and rehearsal of a lot of what we do is tell stories about the person while we're there. And a lot of what I do is listen and hold hands. That's where we begin. And so they mostly haven't thought about what the next steps are. Although the Book of Common Prayer and lots of priests will tell you, think about this stuff before you die, and write it out. Go see your priest, talk about what you want. And that way you're going to relieve your family of having to make a bunch of decisions once you've died. And that's a gift to them. And it will help guide them in that. So, you've asked about a eulogy. Eulogy, is that Latin word for good word. And in Roman culture, it was appropriate to give a eulogy about a citizen, and of course it was rehearsing, the family bona fides and the person and what they did, and interestingly enough, it wasn't simply what they did for themselves. There was a lot of emphasis on how they did things for Rome and the benefits that Rome enjoyed because of that person and their success. So that's a eulogy. And it's a really, it's a thing. If a politician, quite often, but eulogies, believe it or not, are not called for in the Book of Common Prayer. So the rubric in the Book of Common Prayer for a burial service is, when you get finished with the readings, it says a homily may be preached here. And that means a homily may not be preached, but it doesn't also give permission to do a eulogy. And part of this is the theology that's wrapped up in the Book of Common Prayer, some of which was changed between the 28 Prayer Book and the 79 Prayer Book. So let me sort of bring you through. The 28 Prayer Book had no place in it for a homily at all, and was a series of prayers and canticles and hymns. And it was possible to go through a whole 28 Prayer Book service without the person who is being buried being remembered. Now, that was probably a little extreme, because the purpose of the burial service and a memorial service, whichever, is not specifically to remember the person, because that would make them the subject of the service. The subject of the service is always God. The person who's being buried is the object of the service. I know that sounds very technical and probably sanitized, but it's true. So God's always the subject of whatever worship service we do. And the object in this case is the person who we hold before God. And the memory, the memorial, is what God has done for that person and what God has done for all of us in that place and time. Now, it's particularly appropriate that in the service, you do use the person's name. In the homily, you connect that person's life to how God was involved in. And that's a really important part of it. The issue of eulogy or good words, again, because we live in this frenetically paced society, and this is one of the things I think the Roman Catholic Church is really good at. We do actually have it anticipated in the Book of Common Prayer, is to hold the thing called a vigil. And the vigil is a great place for people to tell all those stories and for the eulogy to be said, remembering who this person was, and to do it in extravagant ways. In fact, the prayers. So there's an actual service of vigil. It's kind of very flexible, and the prayers that go with that is uh, are interesting because they're a little different than the prayers in the burial service, but they are actually approved for use within the body of the service. Um, and we talk about what we want God to do for this person in these prayers at the vigil. And here's a quick example. Receive, O Lord, your servant, for he returns to you. And then the people say, into your hands, O Lord, we commend our brother Paul. It's on page 465. And you get to say Paul's name or Enid's name or whoever's name is there like 5 or 6 times.
Mm-hmm.
And because I'm allowed to use that in a burial service, that's my favored prayers for the person at the burial, prayers of the people, because I do want people to remember the person who
Mm-hmm.
is the object of God's care
Mm-hmm.
in that service. So I found that out by reading the rubrics 20 years ago and said, ooh. So I tend to recommend that. And I tend to recommend using, whenever possible, the places where the prayer book calls for us to use the person's name. So here's the thing. The eulogies are important. The stories are important, but there are better settings maybe than the funeral service, the burial service,
Mm-hmm.
for that to be given. So one of those places is at a vigil. One of the places is at a reception. Sometimes I do make allowance, that we put the family remembrances up front. So the service actually does not start until after the family remembrances are done, and yet everybody's already gathered.
Mm-hmm.
And I have also found, not that I would say this will work for everybody, but I've also found having one person do that,
Yeah.
say the eulogy, do that remembrance, and it really is helpful if that one person also writes it out. Funerals are very emotional, and we can be surprised by the underlying emotion that we experience in them, even if we think we've done everything to prepare ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think it's kinder to the speaker, as well as to the gathered, that's the place for that kind of emotion to be. And then to allow the funeral service, the burial service, the requiem, to do work that we as humans sometimes are not willing to engage in, and that's healing work. So we've experienced loss when death happens, and we don't forget that loss, and we don't obscure that loss. What we do is begin to heal that loss. Now that loss will always be there. We'll have tears for it. Hopefully, as it says in Revelation, God's going to wipe the tears from our eyes. It's not that the tears aren't known, it's that we're being comforted by the creator of the universe, and the person who knows us most, the God knows us most intimately. Person's a bad term. The deity who knows us intimately and has, through Christ, experienced suffering and joy and the earthly experience with us. So we want to be reminded of that. We want the healing to begin. And so part of the reason that we don't prescribe a eulogy in the Episcopal Church is there are at least a couple of reasons I can think of. One is, again, it probably inverts the object and the subject of the service.
Mm-hmm.
And I have seen it where in a powerful eulogy or a series of remembrances obscures almost completely what Jesus is there and what we're gathered to be reminded of in church. So there is that, and then there's also the fact that if this person's lived any kind of life, they have people connecting from all over the place and different things, and some of the stuff will be meaningless to people, and then it gets just really obscure, and there isn't enough balance in the service to overcome that. Because, as I remind people, Paul, whose name I pulled out of the air earlier, Paul cannot save you. Jesus can. And so, as good a person as Paul was, he's inadequate to the task of redeeming us. And that's what we want to remind people is it's God who redeems us. It's God who loves us so much that even when we don't want to be redeemed, he redeems us. So I think that's a really important message to get across. And that's how it's designed in the Book of Common Prayer, is to give full range to that, while also allowing for the person and their life and their story to be remembered as part of God's creation. And so, there are certain boundaries around which this works, and the purpose of it isn't to be cruel or forget the person. In fact, we want to weave that person's stories into the greater story of God's saving story. But only God is adequate to that story, and we don't want to put that pressure on the family, on the person, or anyone else to have to bear that weight. That's the weight of glory that Paul talks about in Romans 8 is really hard for impossible for humans to bear, but Christ can, and that's what we want. So we want people to throw all our cares, it says somewhere in this funeral service, to cast all our cares upon God. And so we want to make room for that, and that's the structure around it.
So I've only heard one of your burial rite homilies,
Right.
But I I remember that you did weave the life force of the decedent into the homily. What is that process like for you? And I guess my prior question is the gospel prescribed? Does the family of the decedent have any optionality about which part of the gospel to read?
So the burial rite, like all of the burial rite is anticipated as the liturgy of the word in a Eucharist. Eucharist is optional. I tend to encourage it because there's also another line in the burial rite that says, "This is a foretaste of the heavenly banquet." Oh, yeah, right. So we're hoping that by connecting the receiving of Christ's real presence in a worship service, including one where we're burying somebody, begins that healing process and begins to connect us to that life force, which is Jesus. And the front half is an option of at least one, but up to 3 readings. 3 readings is customary now in the Episcopal Church. 1 from the Old Testament, 1 from the New Testament, and 1 from the Gospels. And we're offered a certain number of readings to choose, and they have some breadth in exactly how they approach the issue of death. There are 2 readings from Isaiah. There's 1 from Lamentations. There are 2 more readings. So there is a choice. It's a limited choice, and I actually think the church has done us a favor by not giving us the option of just picking up a Bible and saying, "What do I do now?" And those cover a lot. And then when you're in the readings from the New Testament that are not the gospel readings, you have 2 from Revelation, you have 2 from Paul, and 1 from 1 John, and they too, cover a lot of breadth about what the church thinks about what happens after someone dies. And then all the gospel readings come from the Gospel of John, and they're all very appropriate. So the families get to choose. And sometimes it's like, when I do marriage counseling, I say, you get to choose your readings, but here are your choices. Um, Quite often, what the couple says they choose for readings says a lot about how they're approaching their marriage. And so the same thing is true when people choose these readings. Is it says a lot about how they um, uh, about what they're trying to say about the person who is the object in the worship service, and therefore it helps. So there's that connection, and I do spend time with the family trying to understand the person that they love. And also in this parish, I'm very fortunate, and I've been here long enough to be very fortunate. I know most of the people who are here. I've had my own personal encounters with them. And so for me to begin to talk about them, not in past tense, but in the beloved sense, I figure that's really what a funeral homily is supposed to be about. How God acted in their lives, and the promise and hope that the church holds to us about what awaits for us, so that we're not a people who, we acknowledge death, but we do not acknowledge that that's it. And the hope we have is this ongoing relationship with God that we began to nurture in our lives here. And so that's what I'm trying to do is, well, how did that person show that nurturing going on? And how did that person, how was that person affected by God's actions in their life? And so for me, a funeral homily is to try and connect that, because in the end, we're trying to remind people that the same God who brought Jesus again from the dead is the same God we proclaim, and therefore we will enjoy that benefit as well.
Well, that's a lot to think about. It's a lot to think about. If you had advice to people who are not imminently confronting the loss of a loved one, but everybody has to face this at some point, what kind of advice would you give people?
So we're very fortunate in the United States to be able to plan a lot of things, because it's rare that death jumps out and takes us by surprise, at least not in the ways they did 50 or 60 years ago. And I know nobody wants to think about it. And here's what I will tell you. I've time and time again been proven that my watching or not watching the Boston Red Sox has no impact on whether they win or lose. And you're going about and trying to prepare for that eventuality is not going to make it happen any faster. It will happen when it happens. It is a wonderful gift to those whom you love to sit down with them to plan this out beforehand, so that in the moment when all of that emotion is running through you, even if you've had a family member who's been in hospice care for 3 years, the moment of it happening, lots of things just come rushing out, and that's a really hard time to think about this stuff. Sit down and write it down. Go to your priest and say, help me plan a service out for my mother, or whatever. Would you come over? My mom's here. She's best at 11 a.m. in the morning, and we can talk about those things. Does your mom have favorite hymns? I would say the same thing too. Get your lawyer and plan out your financials, because leaving your kids with a whole bunch of stuff to have to figure out is probably not nice to them. And we put that stuff up all the time, and it's really hard. I understand it, but it's been, when I first got here and I had a few funerals where I didn't really know the persons that well. I actually had 3 people who had already written that stuff out.
Mm.
And then when I got a chance to talk to their families as we, did the service, and I told them what had been chosen and stuff, and then they told me stories about their family members. It was like, oh yeah, these choices make so much sense, and it just sort of fills it out. And so yeah, I would, if I were going to make a recommendation, I'd recommend to people to sit down and think about that. Look at the readings. Which readings make your heart sing? Which readings do you think are revelatory about you and your relationship with God? What do you want your family to remember about this relationship you had with them and with God while you were alive? Those sorts of things. I think, that's a really important gift. And I think it prepares you, because here's something else. I remember a gentleman who he knew it was going to happen, and he probably had about 3 or 4 months, and he's a very sturdy old New England Yankee, and he called me in, and his wife was there, and he had a special request. His one of his sons was a lounge singer, and he loved Cole Porter, and he's like, I want to have Cole Porter sung at my funeral. And you're like, abba dabba dabba, that's not really prayer book. But we were able to, he and I, with his wife as witness, reach an agreement of how we would handle it. And all the people got to enjoy Cole Porter on his funeral day, but not inside the service, outside the service. But it was right there. They were all gathered. So would not be my choice, but it worked, and he had a really beautiful service, and the burial was, and his wife, for a number of reasons, wrote me a note afterward to say, thank you, your instincts were right. He had other special requests too that we had to work around, and she said, your instincts were right, and I'm very grateful that you advised us. So because I remember when that man died, she was just, they'd been married for 56 years. Wow. And it really just was so very hard on her. And then she was able to relocate with her family and just feel so much better that things had been taken care of properly. So, and the family thanked me too. I may not do everything. I did, certainly make a lot of mistakes, but it's really nice when you did something right and your instincts tell you that's how to approach it. So yeah, that would be my advice. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but I just think it's really important for you to think about your relationship with God. The thing here that I would remind people, this is not simply about mortality then when you're doing this. This is about our relationship with God. It's reminding us of the promises he's made to us. It's reminding us of our end of the bargain too. So I just really think it's a healthy thing to engage in.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to all who are viewing and listening. That's a wrap for episode 11, which I hope explains why the funeral is not just about the deceased. All right, and see you next time on The Upstanding Rector and the Curious Christian.